Good morning. I want to thank Dr. Schmidt for inviting me to participate in this course. When he first contacted me, Jakob thought I should be talking somewhere around April, latter part of April, and it didn't look like a good time frame, so I'm doing it now. As the handout, and I do hope that everyone has a handout, states, my name is, in fact, of Armenian origin. It's Krikorian. I'm a Professor Emeritus in the Biochemistry and Cell Biology department here at Stony Brook, one of Jakob's colleagues. The latter part of my name, IAN, is an Armenian patronymic which means descended from or son of, very much akin to, for instance, in Hebrew, the bin, ben in Arabic, mak, mik in Irish and Scottish, etc. All kinds of languages. In Armenian, of course, it doesn't use the proper, to us, proper alphabet. It uses its own ancient alphabet, IAN. Now, IAN, of course, is transliterated from this, and it comes out as IAN, sometimes YAN, or EAN. And when you see that, straight away, it should come to your mind that this is a name of Armenian origin or extraction, Yan. Now, most of you don't know anything about Armenians. I generally ask people how many have ever heard of Armenia or know any Armenians, and very few hands go up. But it is one of the constituent ethnic minorities in the United States and throughout the world. And you've already been told a bit about Raphael Lemkin, the man who coined the word genocide. And this course that Dr. Schmidt has put together deals with genocide and a specific aspect of it, impunity. In other words, you, quote, get away with it. Now, the Armenian genocide is of considerable interest for a number of reasons. It's a mini-cosm of that whole business. It is a genocide which is even now denied by the perpetrators or their descendants, namely the Republic of Turkey has never admitted having carried out this genocide. They use all kinds of excuses and explanations and reasons, and we're not going to concentrate on that today. We'll do that next time or the time after. But let me just say that ultimately, the amount of information on the Armenian genocide and its reality is very, very substantial. Now, historians always like to refer to primary documents. These are documents that in many cases were not intended to see the light of day or to be waved around too much. They're now deposited in archives, and in the United States, the U.S. National Archives microfilm index on Turkey and the Armenians is very extensive. This is just a thick printout of the microfilm numbers and the draws, etc. Very substantial. You could do the same thing for the German archives, the Austrian archives, the British archives, the French archives. Everyone and anyone during the World War period is in fact capable of yielding important documents on the Armenian genocide. Now, I made a quick reference to the timing of this lecture. Well, as it turns out, April 24th is a significant day among the Armenians for the reason that it was on this date in 1915 that what's come to be called the genocide is in fact starting to take shape. On that day, the intellectuals and intelligentsia of the capital city of the Ottoman Empire, Constantinople, now changed to Istanbul, were collected and in fact arrested and sent off to be sooner or later, mostly sooner, murdered. Now the murders weren't achieved in the capital city itself. They were afraid to do that because there were too many foreign embassies and consulates there. So these people were moved into the hinterlands, and we'll show you before too long that into the remote areas where this heinous act was achieved. Now, let me backtrack again. How is it that the Armenian Genocide, which started in April 24th, 1915, under cover of World War I, came to the notice of the world? Well, we have to go way back. And I'll set the stage a little bit. I won't go into a terrific amount of detail, but there are a few points that you have to know. And that is that what's now the Republic of Turkey, we'll see the map so that you can at least realize that there's a little bit of territory that you can associate and identify. I might tell you also is that many people do not realize or fully appreciate that the empire was rather substantial. It's substantial indeed. In fact, if we look here, we see here the Turkish Empire before the Treaty of 1699, a number of countries that you could probably, if you knew your geography, put together. Sofia, of course, is the capital of modern-day Bulgaria. Bucharest is the capital of modern-day Romania. Belgrade, these are the former Yugoslav countries. Bosnia, Montenegro, Herzegovina. All of these, Hungary, Budapest, all of these were part of the Ottoman Empire. Now, the Ottoman Empire really began rather early in Central Asia through the forebears of the Turks who started moving westward. Now, these people were first the people that we call Seljuks or Seljuk Turks. They moved across very successfully militarily, and they moved into this whole area of what's called Asia Minor and overran everything, paying not too much attention, but finally set up their headquarters in an area where it was rather small. So the Seljukids, or the Seljuk Turks, really weren't too worried about all those countries or little ethnic municipalities, princedoms. You can't even call them kingdoms by later standards, but they ran over everyone and ultimately did better or worse. And to make a long story very short, one of the Turkish tribal groups that took on the name later in Europe as the Ottoman Turks or the Ottomans or the Osmanli Turks unseated the Seljukids, started moving in, taking over, and ultimately a very important date in the history of this entire region. In 1453, the capital of the so-called Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, Constantinople, the Emperor Constantine's city, fell to the Ottoman Turks. 1453. The Greeks, of course, had set up their central government in this area. The Greek Orthodox Church was exceedingly strong. And the Byzantine Empire that emanated from all of that really had to start shrinking, and they certainly shrank in terms of authority. The Turks, the Osmanlis, were in some ways a little bit advanced, and it's yet to be decided exactly how one should look at it, but they set up a system for the minorities called the millet or millet system, whereby Christians such as the Greeks, the Armenians, the Assyrians, the Syrians, these people came under a patriarch. So when one comes across the patriarch of Constantinople on TV every Easter and so forth, the head of the Greek church, he was set up basically by the Ottoman Turks to be the head of a community that in turn would be responsible to the Sultan, which is the Turkish, we use the word Sultan or Sultan. You've heard of Sultana grapes, probably. Sultana grapes. The Sultan said, look, you can do your thing, you can practice your religion, your ethnicity, your language, but you've got to owe allegiance to me, and you've got to do what you're told, and as long as you behave, you'll be all right. You're not going to be as good as we are, because Islam is our avowed and professed proper religion for the empire. But you people, being people of the book, will be tolerated. You'll behave and you'll pay taxes. As long as you do that, you're okay. So the millet, the Greek millet, was set up. By 1461, the Armenian millet was set up. And then something happened that started putting a whole new face on things. Missionaries, for the most part from America, places like Massachusetts, upstate New York, Ohio, Pennsylvania, places like Maine, there was a big movement at that time to spread the word of Christianity around the world. And in the early 1800s, there was a lot of interest in going into the Ottoman Empire to convert these heathens, as it were. They weren't quite bad heathens like the heathens in places like Africa who were animists and so forth, but these people needed conversion. That is to say, fundamental Protestant Christianity, the word of the book. They knew there were some Christians in that area. They knew about the Greeks and the Armenians and the Assyrians and some of the Catholics that the French missionaries had gotten to. But they were viewed as being members of the corrupt churches. The Eastern churches were recognized as Christian, but not really quite up to snuff. They were too much tied to ritual, burning of incense, using languages that no one understood. They were ancient Greek, ancient Armenian, ancient Syriac. No one knew these things. So a lot of it was automated, more or less traditional, based on a lot of faith. Many people were not lettered, educated. So this was a ripe territory for the American missionaries to start moving in. But they didn't do their homework, as I put it. They thought they were going to really reach the Turks, but they didn't quite know that it was against Islamic law to convert. You couldn't convert. You would be liable to all kinds of consequences, such as being put to death. Had they done their homework, they would have said, look, we really aren't going to make much headway with the Turks, so perhaps we'll start with the Greeks. Well, the Greeks say, look, we don't need these people. Don't forget that the Old Testament was in Hebrew, but still don't forget that the New Testament was in Greek. Here you are, you want to put it in modern Greek. You're not going to do that. The patriarchs of Constantinople were very, very conservative. So who's left? They said, well, maybe the Armenians can be persuaded. And it turns out that they were more persuadable than any of the other ethnic groups. They liked the idea that they were being taught things, they were being educated, schools were opened, the Americans were running hospitals, small and modest to begin with, but they appreciated what they could offer. So Protestantism, as espoused by what was called the American Board, the ABCFM, the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, centered in Boston, Massachusetts. Ultimately, one now calls them pure Congregationalists, but they were a little bit more Puritan then than they certainly are now. The archives still exist. There's immense amounts of information in them. Much of the archival material from the ABCFM is at Houghton Library at Harvard, but there's plenty in Boston. Many, many American missionaries went over to Turkey, young women who weren't married, men who were ordained ministers with their wives and families. They did a lot of work and became quite dedicated. Some of the families were over there for many, many generations. One of the famous families, that's a name that's well recognized, especially in Washington, D.C. area, is the Riggs family. The Riggs banks are all over the place in greater D.C. But they took the task of taking the ancient Bibles and these ancient, relatively unintelligible tomes and translating them into the modern vernacular, a little bit like the Roman translations from Latin into the Vulgate so that people could read it. But I want to emphasize to you that many of these people, the missionaries, laid down their lives in a very hostile area health-wise. You know, we're talking in the 1800s when health wasn't that great anywhere, but this is a fine place to rest. Americans in the Protestant cemetery, Feriköy, Istanbul, Turkey. This is just giving a list of some of the graves that are still over there. Not to speak of the countless graves in Asia Minor where missionaries went, whereas I'll build upon, God only knows where they are, because the genocide did occur. I'll go into that a little bit later. And some had died there in service. No one knows where their graves are now. In fact, there's one case, a famous case of a very well-known man whose headstone was found in an antique shop in Istanbul. They had somehow moved it hundreds of miles away from out this way to Constantinople, okay? Now, in this period, we all know about Greeks. There are plenty of Greeks on Long Island. They have a big church. But the Greeks got their independence from the Ottoman Empire as a result of a lot of support from the Europeans and the Americans. And the Armenians, who started getting education from these Protestant Congregationalists, and some, by the way, down this way were the minions of the Presbyterians, started appreciating this new education, learning English, learning other foreign languages. They were already pretty good at that because there had been a spreading of the Armenians, like many other groups, into what's called the diaspora. Some of you have heard the word diaspora. Well, the word really began with the Jews being dispersed out of their native homeland into other regions upon the fall of their temple by the Babylonians. Okay, so now you've got diasporan communities. In this whole area here, this is Armenia in terms of 1920, but at one time it was as big as this whole area here. When the various invaders came in from Asia, the Mongol invasions, the Seljuk invasions, people started either dispersing and moving, and many Armenians moved at that time, we're talking about the Middle Ages, into Europe. Communities in Poland, of all places, communities in England, communities in Austria-Hungary, communities in Bulgaria, all over the place, even India, places like Singapore, Ethiopia, who they were kindred spirits with, incidentally, because of their religion, okay? And in Egypt, before Egypt became Muslimized. And if you go to Jerusalem, you'll see that the Armenian diaspora had moved from this area here down here to what's now Israel and the old city, East Jerusalem. There's an Armenian quarter that's been there for many, many, many years. So the diasporan communities got out. They weren't huge, but they were very influential. They seemed to be a little bit more adventuresome than many. And it'll be interesting to some of you that the first coffee served in cafes in Paris and Vienna were by Armenians from the Ottoman Empire. Even something so simple. There were lots of Turkey carpet traders, traders in opium that were grown here largely by this city here of Smyrna, was the last Christian stronghold in Asia Minor. So you see a huge amount of people. Everyone says that the United States is a melting pot. Well, it's a melting pot after quite a few generations, but for quite a few years, it's also a patchwork quilt. The fact that we recently celebrated St. Patrick's Day is a good indication that the Irish Americans are in fact still alive and well, and everybody and his cousin. In fact, many years ago, a very interesting book was written called The Confession of a Hyphenated American. So you say a Greek American hyphen, and they say, I wish the heck you could get the hyphen out. When are you going to become Americans of Greek descent? And that's basically what happens in time. But there's no sense rejecting your ethnic roots completely. And the thing that I like about this tiny book is that it is small, first of all, but it says that Dr. Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was as much a metaphysician as physician, declared that every man has a blind spot. If he were living in these war-clouded days, he would say, if he were capable of reasoning at a time when the whole world has gone mad, nothing's changed, that every man has a seeing spot and that the rest of him is blind. He might declare a large portion of humanity stone blind, for even the wisest and the fairest among us are in the happy frame of mind in which we believe that we alone have retained vision, now that the world has gone back. Now, what I'm saying is that everybody likes to pretend, especially historians, that they look at things very neutrally, and that they're above it all, and that the sign of a very excellent historian is that they're very, very detached. You have to hop outside your body and look at it, because if you're looking at things too closely, then you become biased and it becomes unfair. Well, the bottom line is that if people would admit up front that we're all highly biased, have our own viewpoint, we all hear what we want to hear, and I'll qualify what I'm going to be saying is, as I've done as much reading as anyone, trying to get all sides, and I might as well have saved my eyesight. Everything I've read convinces me that there was a genocide. Now, I also had a chance as a kid growing up to hear these things from my parents, and who went through things, okay. They were survivors, as it were, and relatives, but they weren't even close relatives, because immediate families were wiped out, okay. The small town that my parents came from, less than 1,000 people, only 35 survivors by actual count. Most of them women, one little boy, who later went insane, incidentally. And there you have it. So when you hear these first-hand accounts of what happened, then it's a little bit different from reading about it and saying, well, it's, you know, there's two sides to every story, blah, blah, blah. Well, maybe that's true, but one of the interesting things that we'll talk about next time in greater detail is that the Turks who perpetrated all of this say, well, look, we lost all kinds of people too. Yeah, you say, yeah, sure, but how did you lose them? You entered a war foolishly, and your troops got killed. That's very different from a essentially civilian population being uprooted under conditions that were made to guarantee the most incredibly high percentages of loss of life. Now, Raphael Lemkin, who coined the word genocide, so much has been written about him, and again, a lot recently has been rewritten, and they're starting to do a little bit of research on him, but I have very mixed feelings about him. I think he was a very good guy who did his best to think things through. He was a jurist, which means that he was a highly educated lawyer, and he believed in law. He thought everything had to be done by law, and that the law was important, and that the crime of genocide was in fact a crime, and that if you put some legislation in place, you would then have the means to prosecute. And at the same time, the fact that you would prosecute would put the fear of God, as it were, in would-be perpetrators, so that they, well, I better not do anything because I'm going to be caught and punished. Well, the fact is that he was exceedingly naive. I mean, it's hard to believe now that he was as naive as he turned out to be. And the amount of work, as I said, is pretty impressive. And there's one book that I want to draw to your attention that just came out, written by Stephen Leonard Jacobs, who happens to be a professor at the University of Alabama in Birmingham, but he's also a Jewish rabbi. New York Public Library, of several places, have a lot of the Lemkin papers and the archival things. He wrote a lengthy, book-length chapter on the Armenian Genocide. He's covered all these other genocides. He can be viewed as being one of the very first, if not the first, historian of genocides. He died a very broken, sad fellow. He's buried in Mount Hebron Cemetery on Long Island. We visited it. It was really hard to find. The grave had been much neglected. We photographed the stones. We had to clean it off, the bird droppings, etc. So while people talk that genocide is very important and that Raphael Lemkin was a prophet in his time and a model for all of us, the fact is that no one's going to really remember him. If they remember anything, they'll say, well, he came up with the word genocide. Now, on the handout that I've given, there's a lot of information about genocide and genocides in general, and they were selected because they're all accessible on the internet. You don't have to even go into the library. You can click and it'll come up. So they were carefully selected for accessibility. We know students don't like to read as much as they should. But Lemkin made a guest appearance on an important program years ago put out by the UN Casebook 21 series, and it was hosted by a man who ended up, strangely enough, living in St. James, Long Island. But I found that out after he had died, which is a pity. But the fact was that you have this very, very rare film footage which has been transcribed and is now available on the internet. And again, the references in that stack there, of what he had to say about the Armenian Genocide. It was a very important point in his life because much earlier than what's come to be called the Nazi Holocaust against the Jews, he was asking his parents and teachers and even law professors, how come this was allowed to happen? And the arguments that they gave him were completely not satisfactory. He didn't like it one bit. One analogy was that, well, if a farmer has his chickens and if he wants to kill them, that's his business. Well, Dr. Schmidt will be giving a lecture on this business of impunity based on we have no right to interfere in the affairs of a sovereign nation. So if you want to kill your civilians, that's your business, none of my business, as long as you don't come over and kill my citizens. So this thing is like a merry-go-round. It goes around and around and around. And others have said, look, genocide is a word that has been misused, even though it's been defined legally. Genocide against the American Indians. Now, this is just a small thing, but huge amounts of information. There's a wonderful TV series, rather old, called How the West Was Lost. Not how the West was won. How the West was lost. What the Americans have done to our Native Americans, the Americans, Indians, is an embarrassment. And it does constitute a real genocide if you go by the legal definitions that you can read in terms of Lemkin's Genocide Convention that he worked so hard to move forward. I'm going to take a drink of water, okay? So, now, here's another book. It's been reprinted, but it was put out some time ago, 1951 to be exact. We Charge Genocide, the historic petition to the United Nations for relief from a crime of the United States government against the Negro people. The UN didn't want to hear that. It was bad enough getting the Genocide Convention even noticed after Lemkin basically worked himself silly. This was spurned largely because, number one, they didn't want to hear it, we didn't want to hear it, and more importantly, perhaps, the people who were pushing this tended to be a little bit, what we say, pink or communist. And of course, in that period, the argument was that, well, communists, you know, whatever. But the fact is that the word has become overused. And the question whether or not it was a genocide, or oh, this was not a genocide, or this was a genocide, but that wasn't, it's a joke anymore. Because if you follow the definition, the genocides that are being covered in this course that Jakob has put together, they qualify as genocides, no doubt about it. And one of the great thinkers of today, a retired professor at MIT, Noam Chomsky, a great linguist, has written, "The traditional imperial powers are alone in adopting Rice's emerging international norm in the conventional form that she doubtless have in mind." Now, you may or may not know who the Rice that he's referring to is. Condoleezza Rice, okay. Again, that should hardly come as much of a surprise. As for the term genocide, quote unquote, perhaps the most honorable course would be to expunge it from the vocabulary until the day, if it ever comes, when honesty and integrity can become an emerging norm. So here you have it. Now, the Holocaust has taken on its own life, and everybody knows about the Holocaust, it seems. There's millions of films made, zillions of articles, thousands of books, and we even have a big museum, the U.S. National Holocaust Museum and Memorial in Washington, D.C., funded tremendously by the U.S. taxpayers. But whether or not all these other so-called lesser genocides are given much notice is something that will come to the fore in greater or lesser detail. This business of an epitaph for Raphael Lemkin, one of the many biographies written, is probably one of the better ones. It still has some problems, but again, not to throw too many stones. If you don't like it, write your own book is the normal counteract. But I do want to at least draw attention to a few things. I mentioned this big fat thing on the microfilm index of the U.S. National Archives. Okay. Now, let's take our attention. The Armenian massacres, 1894, 1896, U.S. media testimony. This is just from our own press. These were massacres achieved under one of the most notorious of the sultans, Abdul Hamid. Sultan Abdul Hamid II. Came to the throne in 1876 and was unseated in 1909, but basically the Young Turk Revolution took place in 1908. Now, some of you have heard of the Young Turk Revolution, or at least you've heard of the word Young Turk. I get annoyed because there are a number of radio programs where they're talking about the Young Turks, as if this is something to admire. Well, the Young Turks, in its best, a very short life of the more positive viewpoint of it, is that you were considered a little bit of a rebel, an independent, you weren't going to be tied to the old ways, you were going to modernize. But we'll see momentarily that the Young Turk Revolution started off briefly okay and very quickly deteriorated. But let's pop back to Sultan Abdul Hamid II. This long list of sultans that reigned over this whole empire, which isn't even totally shown. If we go to the next one, can we see the next slide? We see here a little bit better in that you're seeing this here is Syria, all of the troubles up here now in Aleppo, Mosul in Iraq, and it's not Iraq or Iran, it's Iraq or Iran. Down here is the Beersheba is Israel now, of course, Haifa. Beirut is Lebanon. That was in those days called the Lebanon. It was only a section of Syria. It was the more Christianized section, Maronite, Melkite, semi-Catholic Arabs, a lot of Muslims, of course. Down here is what's now Saudi Arabia. All of that was part of the Ottoman Empire. And after the war, which this map kind of outlines briefly, they're talking about how Turkey was going to be divvied up into various and sundry spheres of influence. There was going to be an Italian sphere, French sphere, and of course the part that I like is the British sphere. Of course they had to make sure the British were going to get all the oil, which was even then becoming better appreciated. But this dividing up after World War I had been thought of a lot earlier, way earlier. In the 1870s, and even earlier, but let's start in the 1870s, Russia, the old Tsarist Imperial Russia, wanted control over this so-called zone of the Straits. This is the Black Sea. Russia, starting here, Batum, going up northward, Russia wanted access through the straits so it could come down into the Mediterranean. And everything that was done in those days by Russia was to get a little bit of an excuse to start getting their foothold. And part of the mentality was that the Turkish sultans, to varying degrees, especially Abdul Hamid, were very bad to the Christians. Very, very outrageous atrocities. I mean, massacres were a mode of administering, and people were kept under control. You put a very harsh thumb on them, and that kept them quiet for a while. But you see, you're starting to get this education in place with the Protestant missionaries, people going off to Europe to get educated, coming to America, going to Amherst, Oberlin College, Colgate, Colby, all of these places, they're starting to get degrees and go back to the old country and teach a little bit about Western values. They're saying, okay, you need now to realize that the French Revolution had an objective and that it's not right to be treated like you're owned by someone, and you're not supposed to be massacred if you look at someone the wrong way or pretend that the Armenians were particularly victimized in this period, in that Sultan Hamid, who interestingly enough was sometimes rumored to have Armenian blood in his veins, he even prevented the word Armenia from being used. It was illegal. You were not allowed to use the word Armenia. There was a college that was formed in eastern Turkey, a place called Harput, sometimes spelled U-T. The H in Armenian was guttural, Harput, but people couldn't pronounce it easily, so the spelling was retained even though the pronunciation wasn't. Well, in Harput, there was a college incorporated in the laws of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and it was called Armenia College. the Sultan complained, and they ended up changing it to Euphrates, named after the river, Euphrates River. Okay, here it is here. And Sultan Hamid was really an autocrat. He suspended the constitution. They thought they were going to have a little bit of lightening up. These various and sundry rescripts would be issued from the royal palace, and people were going to be treated equally, and that we're all going to be getting along very well. And the Armenians actually believed all this. They liked the idea that they would be able to do their thing. After all, they had the millet system. That was good. Some people complained that the millet system had its shortcomings, and they said, look, the imperium in imperio, in other words, this is a empire within an empire. Pay your taxes, obey the Sultan, and you're okay, all right? But Abdul Hamid overdid it. He perpetrated some incredible massacres in Bulgaria. The Gladstone from England, who was very anti-Turkish, said, look, these Bulgarian horrors give us every excuse to get the Turks out of Europe. Because you see, up here, all that part that I pointed to in Europe, Hungary and Bulgaria, Turkey in Europe, after 1878, when the Russians had picked a war on the Turks and won, and was ready to take over the Straits, and supposedly had done well for its Christian subject co-religionists. The Slavs were all Greek Russian Orthodox. And there was going to be a lot of pressure on the Turks. Abdul Hamid was told, look, you better get your act together and start making some reforms here. Now, we'll see in the next slide, this picture here, I can spend a year on it. This is the eastern area that was traditionally, in days of antiquity, Armenia. The last independent kingdom of Armenia collapsed in 1375. That's a long time ago. In fact, when the Arab invasions of this area took place in an area called Cilicia, the Armenian king and his wife and family were taken to Egypt. The Pope, after a while, interceded on their behalf because they had converted to Roman Catholicism during the Middle Ages, when the Crusades were going on and people were going to Jerusalem to take over the Holy Land from the heathen Turk, etc. And with the intervention of the Pope, the idea was that he would be let out of Egypt. They let him go to Spain for a little bit, where he was made an honorary lord in Madrid, and then ultimately went into France, where he died. They had a tomb in Saint Denis next to Notre Dame Cathedral. During the Revolution, the grave was kind of all messed up, but then they reconstituted it, and he's buried there. So the last Armenian kingdom of Cilicia, Lesser Armenia as it was called, fell in 1375, and the whole area was totally Muslimized, and the millet system really was okay, but people said, look, one explanation of the millet system is to kind of streamline the administration. The other was that if you're an Orthodox Muslim, you don't want to be dealing with these non-believers, these infidels. So by getting this dead carcass off your hands, you're keeping yourself. You needed a permit to get buried. That's how bad the control was. The control wasn't all an empire within an empire. You did what you were told, and they have said many, many times it was an art form for non-Muslims to exist in the Ottoman Empire, despite all of the PR that modern-day Turkey spreads on the very open, advanced, accepting mentality of the country and the people and its leaders. You can write a book about that too. It's far less rosy than they would have you believe. But getting back to this, Asia Minor, sometimes referred to as Anadolu or Anatolia, belies its Greek roots in that Anatolia in Greek means the East. So here you have Greece over here. This was basically Anatolia. When Alexander made his way across Asia, all the way to Afghanistan and northern India, some people even stayed in this area here, which is called the Pontus. So we have a fair number of Greeks, Pontic Greeks, living in the Pontus, in Trabzon, Samsun, Giresun. By the way, this area is viewed by plant people as one of the major centers for cherries. Some of the world's best and most delicious cherries come from this neck of the woods. Now, I'm getting scattered here a little bit, but I'm trying to make a point. Eastern Armenia, which the Turks had pretty much let be. They said, look, these are nothing to worry about. If we want to just snuff them out, we can in a minute. It was all very undeveloped. If you were a missionary, you came in, and it would take weeks to get in down here. Horrible roads. They weren't even real roads. They were like cart tracks. Very mountainous. Communities separated. Short distances gave rise to numerous dialects even. So the area was really the boondocks. And there weren't that many roads and no railroads. Look at this. This is the railroad. Okay, Constantinople. The Europeans were hot to get their clutches on the ability to put in railroads. And the French and the Germans were wooing the sultans with bribes, gifts, you name it, various and sundry machinations to get concessions to, in fact, build railroads. This area was allegedly full of minerals. There's a fair amount of chromium in Turkey, incidentally. It was very important during World War II to make steel. But the area still remained very remote. So when we were talking about April 24th, and the Armenian intellectuals and intelligentsia being arrested and being sent out into the boondocks, this here was one of the great cities of the world ever since the days of Byzantium. People were shocked when Constantinople fell. The walls were immense, thick, huge. They're still in place now, some of them, if you go to Istanbul and see. But out here, beautiful, but very rugged and rough. Everyone wanted a piece of it. And the jealousy of the great powers was such that when Russia won the War of 1878, the Treaty of San Stefano, which was signed very close to Constantinople, the English said, no, we don't like that. England was very jealous of Russia. So we'll have to have a new meeting. And they convened it in Berlin. The meeting of the Treaty of Berlin watered down anything that could be construed as something positive for the Christian minorities of the Ottoman Empire. It said that we'll do some reforms, and Sultan Hamid was brilliant at manipulating people. There are huge numbers of cartoons put out by European cartoonists at the time where he was great at balancing act. He had so many loans that he had to pay off. People were afraid that if we unseat him, if we break up the empire, if we give too many concessions to one European versus another, we won't get our money, we won't have our opportunities for investment. So the jealousies of what came to be called the Concert of Europe Now, the Concert of Europe is, again, by cartoonists, drawn up as a bunch of people playing musical instruments. It really was nothing more than a major committee to make sure that things didn't happen that you didn't want to have happen, okay? You have to make sure the French and the English and the Russians and the Germans kept the balance. No one had to have too much power. So Sultan Hamid knew how to manipulate this. He kept his empire intact pretty much, except he did lose the European countries, Turkey and Europe. And he was explaining to someone one day, it was all right for me to lose my arms and legs, but I could not afford to lose the trunk of my body. He viewed all the countries of Turkey and Europe, Bulgaria, Romania, all of those as being arms and legs, but he could not afford to lose this part here. Now, who was in the way here? A bunch of Armenians who were doing reasonably well economically, being infidel Christians who kind of behaved themselves. But they started talking a little bit about reforms, and revolutionary parties came into being because the reforms that were promised and signed and sealed never happened. They said, look, we're not going to get anywhere. They made some poor decisions at the time because they thought, look, the European segment got their independence or sovereignty, but we should too. Well, the thing that they had overlooked is that in this area here, there are an awful lot of Muslims, Kurds, who you've heard about. Kurds and Muslims had been moved in from the area in between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. All of these people that, you know, the Southern Caucasus, where the Russians had political problems with the Chechens and Chechnya, all of those people started moving in, and Armenians were moving out. You vote with your feet, as I put it. And ultimately, you've got an area which is very much diluted. And to seek independence of any sort, or even slight autonomy, was madness. There was no way they were going to get it. So in the 1890s, as a result of wanting to keep things under control, Abdul Hamid issued orders. No one's ever found them, but it looks as though he put it in the following way. And I use Thomas Becket as an example, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Will no one rid me of this meddlesome archbishop? That's not like saying, well, go and kill him. Almost as good. Sultan Hamid said, look, I'll box the ears of these Armenians so they'll behave and not even think about independence. So the Armenian massacres of the 1890s, described here, probably had as many as 300,000 victims, some by direct massacre, others as a result of starvation and deprivation. And I want to put a point in here while I'm at it. In the East at that time, women counted for nothing. You girls and women will be unhappy to hear that, but there was no such thing as suffrage. You were all but owned by your husband. If you got a divorce, the kids were his, not yours. And the Turks and Kurds who were doing these, what they call ethnic cleansings, were kind of gentlemen, not too much, but sort of, and many women were let be, and the men became the main target. So the expression targeted genocide surfaces in some circles, where the women suffered terrifically not having a breadwinner, because in that culture, again, you were a homemaker, you didn't go out and work. If you didn't have someone bringing home the bacon or doing the men's work, you'd starve. So many, many people. So all of these missionaries were sending out reports. This is what's going on. The American papers were full. All kinds of fundraising was done, even by Clara Barton, the founding mother of the American Red Cross. She, with a lot of gumption, forced her way into Turkey against Abdul Hamid's wishes and got permission to give American charity to the survivors of the Hamidian massacres. They said in the beginning, no, we don't, we'll look after our people, blah, blah. Well, she was really apparently quite a good diplomat, and she never got into the interior, but she took people who did. She was getting on in years, and she functioned pretty much up in Constantinople. So there's a very large, again, archival base of information in the American Red Cross for the Hamidian massacre people. So now let's hop forward a little bit and say that the Treaty of Berlin really made things, it went from bad to worse. The Hamidian massacres had occurred. You couldn't even get out of the empire if you weren't given permission. You need an exit visa, so to speak. Many immigrants coming into America from that period got out by hook or crook or by luck. And some of the earlier Armenian immigrants who had come over as potential silkworm, mulberry tree growing experts in the 1600s to Virginia colony. Some of the people who came over for training, but they weren't huge numbers. But many of them came to places, interestingly enough, as Massachusetts, where I come from, Worcester, Boston, Watertown, where there are even now substantial Armenian communities. So people from the Hamidian massacres immigrated to America in that period. Some went to Fresno, California, and one of the famous native sons of Fresno, American, who's dead now since '81, a famous writer and playwright, one William Saroyan, came from that area. So we've got the people immigrating into America as a result of a diasporic displacement. In other words, you just didn't decide, oh, I'm going to shift and come over here. They were driven out. They said, look, if we don't get out, we're not going to have a chance to get out. Another marvelous movie by Elia Kazan. Kazan was of Greek extraction, born in Constantinople, and this is the story of his uncle coming from an area in Eastern Asia Minor, okay, from this area here and coming to America. He makes it from here up to Constantinople, and it's a very excellent film, and it's been relatively recently reissued on DVD. This is on Greeks, but there's a very heavy Armenian component in it. And I've always said it was a pity that I found out late in life that Elia Kazan lived in New York City rather than Hollywood. And one would have had the opportunity to interview him. His movie making, as far as this was his favorite film. He didn't say it was his best film, but he said, this is my favorite. It's all black and white, and it's beautifully done. And it's very accurate. I mean, it's incredible how accurate he had it. And this is all based on family records, but he chucked them out. They're not part of his papers, which are at Princeton. You can't get the archival story on that. Now, the argument made by Turks that we're going to get back to a little bit later is that all of these reports coming out into places like America and Europe were really bad-mouthed, were nothing but bad-mouthings by these missionaries, starting with the Hamidian massacres. The Turk in America, the creation of an enduring prejudice by Justin McCarthy, who is a professor at the University of Louisville. And if you read this, he will come up with the idea that all these people were just absolutely uninformed, misinformed, nasty fundamentalists wanting to throw stones at the Turks. They didn't understand the Turks and had nothing good to say about these people. And I think that this is an insult to the Americans. One of the best parts of our sociology is the tremendous outreach programs that were initiated by American missionaries and relief givers as early as the Hamidian massacres. After all, you watch TV now and you're constantly being asked to make donations for this, that, and the other. The American infrastructure was not at the level then that it is now. It took an awful lot of work and a lot of good people to decide that they were going to try to help things. Now, the business of moving to the concert of Europe, juggling things here. Let's take a look at the next slide, please. Now, this gives you a little bit better idea of this whole area. The idea was to start building a railroad that was going to start in Hamburg, go through Berlin, and go all the way down to Baghdad. This was the so-called Baghdad Bahn. This was going to go through the Asia Minor. Some have said, and of course historians love to argue everything, always, nonstop. They recycle. They can't agree on the color red, as I put it. Well, it's not really red. It's kind of more pink. Germany wanted to colonize the Ottoman Empire. It really wanted to move people into this area, build its railroad, take over the resources. The German colonies weren't very well developed. You know, they were in Southwest Africa, they had German East Africa, but they kind of had areas around New Guinea and so forth. But compared to France, which had this enormous empire in Africa, and Britain, where they claimed the sun never set on the British Empire, the idea of getting Germany into a top-rate situation was Kaiser Wilhelm's dream. Now, his grandmother was Victoria. Kaiser Wilhelm's mother was Victoria's eldest daughter. Anyways, Kaiser Wilhelm wanted this railroad, and he wanted the rights to it, and he paid visits to Sultan Hamid in Constantinople, right around the time he was Sultan Hamid was out in the doghouse as a result of the Armenian massacres. The others gave him the cold shoulder and called him the assassin and the bloody or the red sultan. They weren't going to touch it, had to keep away from him for a while, give him the cold shoulder. Here is the Emperor of Germany, Kaiser Wilhelm, making his way to visit. Then he made another visit a little bit later on with his wife. They were going to dedicate one of the great Lutheran churches in the Holy Land at that time, so they made a big photo op out of that. Nothing has changed. I keep on saying that maybe the techniques have improved, but the old mentality of this scheming and machination that we're all embroiled in now, nothing has changed. Same old, same old, same old, deja vu all over again. So here you have attempts on the part of the Germans to woo the Turks to their side to enter the war when World War I breaks out. Okay, we've jumped quite a few years ahead, but I should point out in between, in 1909, these young Turks had taken over, and they were supposed to be giving the Armenians and the other Christian minorities a fair shake. And the very conservative religious element of the empire didn't like what was happening. I mean, how can a non-Muslim be equal to a Muslim? It can't be done. Now, in this area of ancient Lesser Armenia, in this area here, where the king got, when the empire, when it collapsed in 1375 and he went off to Egypt and then ultimately to France, this area here was a fairly rich area. It's even now a big producer of cotton. It's good agricultural land. The Armenian community here, it turns out, got a little bit too feisty in that they started really acting as though that what had legally been said, that we're all equal now, they took it literally. I think they should have read between the lines. But they took it on faith. And there was a lot of agitation, and some new massacres broke out. So in April of 1909, the so-called Adana, which you can see up there as a city, the Adana or Cilician massacres broke out. Somewhere between 20,000 30,000 people got done in. And they were a little bit less gentlemanly this time in that there are a fair number of women who suffered as well. Okay, so we've got this, not just the genocide is where it happened. There's already a movement towards violent means of suppression. Now, at what point does it turn out to be genocide? It turns out to be genocide when you end up saying, look, we're going to deal with this in a definitive way. The so-called Armenian question was going to be solved. Now, this is a book that's kind of interesting. It's a magazine issue from 1950, and it says, and this is kind of an interesting thing. I haven't looked into it, but I wanted to. This document was presented to the subcommittee on March 3, 1950. This is the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, March 3, 1950. On June 14th, a gentleman who claimed to be the architect of the Genocide Convention got in touch with the office of the Armenian National Council of America, seeking support for the ratification of the convention by Congress. A 3-hour interview ensued the following day with the director of the council. It was discouraging to learn that this gentleman, Raphael Lemkin, was willing to accept support for his project from any source, preferably reactionary groups, including those who had worked with the Nazis during World War II. Now, the fact is that he goes on to say that in the entire letter of 4 solid paragraphs, there is not one single reference as to who were the perpetrators of this violence to the Armenians. This is a new kind of fight for, quote, decency, end quote, in the world. It is not enough to talk about Turkish atrocities for Armenian consumption. The truth must be proclaimed in season and out of season, everywhere, unstintingly, courageously. Now, it said that the Armenian National Council of America will be no party to such worthless campaigns. If the Genocide Convention is to be ratified with tongue-in-cheek, it will be a worthless scrap of paper. No sound world can be built on falsehood or suppressed truth. Now, that's kind of an interesting thing, I think, and perhaps you do too, in that we've seen Lemkin talking about, well, you need to compromise. You need to, his early ideas were really quite tight, well written, but because people were not willing to kind of go too far, he had to kind of give up bits and pieces. And in fact, on this UN Casebook 21, there's a section where the Southern senators weren't quite sure whether they wanted to push it because they were afraid that the lynchings of blacks down in Georgia, Alabama might constitute a troublesome point. So the minute you start doctoring things, putting a little bit too much leeway in, you end up creating problems. I think that's a very visionary statement, because the problem is that no one can agree on what the genocide is. It's in the law, but no one wants to pay attention to the law. And as I have said, there's no doubt that Raphael Lemkin's turning in his grave. He would be horrified that what he intended has become just thrown out. Now, the business of getting back to ethnicity for a minute, there's a book here called Torn Between Two Lands. Armenians in America, 1890 to World War I. People used to even commute back and forth. They'd come home for the summer and they'd go back to the old country. Now, this caused certain kinds of problems in the Ottoman Empire, because they had very strict laws on who was going to be a subject of the empire or an American citizen. Now, let's get back to this Euphrates College area in Harput. American missionaries became very upset, in particular during the Hamidian massacres, because they lost some real estate in the Harput area. Buildings were burned, and they wanted money back from the Sultan, and the Sultan used the old-time excuse, well, this was a natural disaster, we couldn't control what was going on. These people, and of course that was not true. Everything that went on in the Ottoman Empire was controlled from Constantinople. He had one of the hugest spy networks on earth. He was brilliant in terms of getting info. So here, the Americans ultimately, only after they were threatening to send warships to Turkey, did the Sultan finally say, yeah, well, yeah, we'll make good and you can rebuild? They said, what's the next best thing? Well, we'll set up a consulate in the Harput area. They had consuls from Britain and in this area, Trebizond, Erzurum, Sivas, you had American consul, but Harput got a consul, a designated, but the Sultan wouldn't give him permission to set up shop. So they sent someone over. He had to wait and wait and wait and wait. And I mean, the sluggish machinery of the empire. And ultimately, it was only in the early part of the 1900s, early 1900s, that the American consulate at Harput was opened. It actually occurred, this city, small city, is up on a hill, high up on a hill. The lower city, 3,000 feet lower, is a town that was more recent called Mazada. And that's where the American consulate actually was. Now I'm going to jump ahead to 1914. The consul in Harput, Mazara, was a man named Masterson. Interestingly enough, he came from Gene Taylor's hometown in Kentucky, okay, Carrollton, Kentucky. He and his new wife came to Harput. He was there, he did 2 terms, but in his second term he brought his wife. And they were there for a while, and they even had a daughter, a baby daughter. And we got to know her. Mary Masterson was born and was moved out as a baby from Harput when her father got a new posting in South Africa. He went to Durban. So Mary Masterson's mother kept pretty good records and even photographs that are very well labeled. And we now have these. She gave them to us. We thought that we weren't going to be able to locate any, but she went prowling through her closets and came across with a treasure trove of information. She died in her 90s in Carrollton. The next consul was a man that was quite an important fellow named Leslie Emerton Davis. Now, he's of special interest because he was born in Port Jefferson, Long Island, and is buried in Port Jefferson. He was the last United States consul for the United States of America in Asiatic Turkey as the Armenian Genocide unfolded. Now, let's backtrack a little bit so there's no confusion, whatever. The town where the consulate was right where my pointer is, the point right there, south, okay. So Leslie Emerton Davis was put in an area doing consular duties which very quickly devolved and evolved from what a consul normally did. A consul normally dealt with commerce, hooking people up, say in the United States, with their trying to find out new markets to sell stuff. He ended up being an American representative in this boondock area. Now, he liked the boondocks. He actually was in Batum in Russia and asked to be moved. He was very athletic, apparently, was a good horseback rider. He used to go out riding his horse. He had 3 kids, We had the privilege of meeting his eldest son before he died up in Rhode Island. And Leslie Emerson Davis has become a little bit of an icon in the Armenian community in particular, because he wrote a report which was put in the United States National Archives at the request of the head of the consular service. And this was edited several years ago by a woman named Susan K. Blair, a Long Islander, by the way. And with a long introduction to his final report, which, if anyone reads this, comes away saying, how could anyone in his right mind say there wasn't a genocide? He even took photographs of some of the dead bodies, but they became separated from his report, and his report became misplaced in the archives and had to be rediscovered. Some say they were deliberately moved or lost. And his pictures, which we've looked for, we can't find them. The interesting thing is that some of these photographs refer to an area where there were 10,000, 20,000 dead bodies in between these mountain crevices in the remote. And the province of Harpert, which in Turkish is Mamuret-ül-Aziz, ended up being called by him the slaughterhouse province, because people would be taken there and done in. And no one had to worry, because it was so remote that only a few of these missionaries that were still around and gave witness. So again, I just keep on saying that when people write these books bad-mouthing the missionaries and those people who were there, saying they're not giving a true and honest account, they're insulting, our own best people. They're American. He happens to have a Turkish wife, incidentally. So there you have it. So we'll build that up. But now, let me go a little bit further. There's a number of things written called monsters. Now, on this cover, if we look at Stalin on the left, we've got Adolf Hitler. Everyone knows about Hitler. If they don't, they've been living under the proverbial rock. But to put Talat Pasha and the Armenian massacres. Now, who is this Talat Pasha? When the Young Turk Revolution occurred, people were optimistic that things were going to get better. There was, in fact, a coup, and there were 3 leaders who, now, I'm going to write it with 2 A's because the writing at the period was that Talat Pasha. He was the Minister of the Interior. And now the word Pasha is a honorific. You actually have to be bestowed, well, you have to have it bestowed upon you. It's a little bit like becoming Sir or Dame in the British Empire. Talat Pasha started off as a bey. Bey just means Mr. I don't know if you recall an old Turkish movie star who was called Turhan Bey. That was a title that was cooked up for him. But these pashas were really like a junta that took over. The Sultan got deposed. Abdul Hamid was sent off to Salonika in northern Greece now. He was replaced by his brother, Mohammed V. Now, Mohammed V, who succeeded Sultan Hamid really was a very timid fellow. They say he was quite gentle. He hadn't been brought up to become a sultan. He just kind of sat around and read and ate and enjoyed his huge harem. And he was told what to do by the triumvirate. He didn't even know what was going on, they claim. And in any case, after this group came into power, it became eventually very clear that they were going to play games with the various European powers. But Enver had spent a lot of time in Germany, was quite a Germanophile. He, being the military arm, decided that Turkey would enter the war on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary. And the beginning of the genocide occurred when Talat and these three and others decided that the Armenians were going to be troublesome. Because one of the first things that was going to happen during the beginning stages of World War I in the Caucasus area, between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, Enver was going to invade Russia. And he sent his troops in, a fairly large Turkish army. But again, as I say, they didn't do their homework. And they fell prey to the winter. Huge percentage of the Turkish army was lost, frozen, starving, ill-prepared. And the point that I haven't made sufficient emphasis of is that this area of the Black Sea and the Caspian, this part here, ancient Armenia had been divvied up for a very long time between Turkey, Russia, and Persia. So you had people who were ethnic Armenians who were Russians. Now, when the war started, a fair number of these people were called up, as it were, volunteered to go fight the Turk. And at the battles that I'm talking about, that the Enver and his troops got demolished, it had some Armenian people in it. Some had even gone, admittedly, from the Ottoman Empire and served in the Russian army, but most of them were Russian Armenians. Enver came back to Turkey trying to make excuses as to why he had botched up the invasion of Russia. And they said, look, these Armenians are turncoats. They are potential for a troublemaking element that's going to side with our enemy. And we've got to deal with it. Now, I'm going to stop at that point because the Armenian problem, the Armenian question, as it had been called, and is still called by some catalogers, comes to this point where you have to say, look, is this a crucial watershed in the history of the Armenian people? And the answer is that it is, because just before Turkey entered the war on the side of Germany, Russia, England, and France had finally gotten together and said, look, we are going to get some reforms in the eastern areas of the empire, and we're going to take all these provinces and meld them into two big provinces, have Europeans as the major administrators of each of those, a Norwegian and a Dutchman, as it turned out. And the Turks had agreed to that, and the idea was, oh boy, there's going to be some reforms. We won't be attacked and murdered and robbed. But the war started. The people who were appointed to take their positions as head of the two mega provinces never made it eastward. And the rest will be, as we'll soon see, history. But that was a watershed. If things hadn't quite happened the way they did, things would have reformed and maybe would have been all right. But as it turned out, they went from bad to worse, and now we're at the point where we can talk a little bit more about the genocide.